Whenever you are.
And just in case, do we need to do anything for the camera, like let them know what the topic is or anything?
No, we're good.
All right, so whenever the affirmative is ready.
6 minutes starting now. It is an honor to open this afternoon's round of debate on behalf of the University of Notre Dame. I'd like to begin with framework. First, our weighing in today's round is going to be the side that wins to be the side that best promotes democracy. To go about defining that virtue of democracy, I want to use famed political philosopher Karl Popper's definition. That is, that democracy constitutes the rule of the people and the people having a right to rule. Popper gives us three primary legs of what qualifies as functional civic democracy. That is, that democracy must be responsive, it must be representative, and it must protect the rights of those under it. So if a democracy lacks any of those three fundamental legs, then it fundamentally fails to qualify as a democracy. The affirmative side in today's round is going to illustrate how under the status quo, DC fails to satisfy all three of those legs, and under the affirmative plan, it meets them and thus defends the value of democracy under the affirmative side. Moving on to our first contention, taxation without representation. That's taxation without representation. Per the IRS, DC residents pay more federal income taxes per capita than any state in the union, and more in net gross aggregate than 19 states individually. They have 0 voting senators and only 1 non-voting delegate in the House. No voting senators equals no confirmation of presidential appointments, no leadership in federal agencies, no confirmation of U.S. ambassadors, and no interaction at all with the nomination of Supreme Court justices. This is true even for the federal courts within DC's own boundaries. Other states can have their judges selected by appointment of the governor or a legislature or specific elections. DC has 0 say at all over any judges within the District of Columbia whatsoever. Moving on to the second contention, denial of full citizenship rights. It's denial of full citizenship rights. DC residents serve in the military, they pay federal taxes, they serve on juries, yet they lack equal rights under the law, namely full congressional representation and local legislative autonomy. I want to hone in on that local legislative autonomy. So there are specific Court of Appeals in the Superior Court, again, are like no local jurisprudence or democratic processes produces these officials. They're only direct presidential appointees. From their Home Rule Charter of 1973, their number of legislators in DC's City Council is restricted to 13 with no provision at all for the growth of their population to produce more representation for citizens there. They fundamentally lack local legislative autonomy. This creates de facto second-class citizenship in the heart of American government. It erodes public trust and creates a permanent underclass of Americans without equal voice in national decisions, clearly violating the 14th Amendment's equal protection principles. DC's got 0 legislative ability to set its own budget or reform its own procedures whatsoever. Granting DC statehood ensures residents are full citizens in both rights and responsibilities, just like the residents of any other state. It enforces the promise that citizenship in the U.S. comes with equal participation in governance, just as citizens of every other state in the Union have. Moving on to our third point, national security and emergency response. That's national security and emergency response. During the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, DC's Mayor Muriel Bowser had no authority at all to deploy the National Guard. Only the White House could approve it in conjunction with Congress, delaying crucial security responses. You get a major impact here. This vulnerability threatens not only the people of DC, but the security of the federal government itself. Lack of local control over emergency response has made the Capitol less safe and more politically vulnerable. It took more than 4 hours from the time the Capitol Police Chief made the call for backup to when the DC National Guard arrived. The House Committee said in December that Mark Meadows, the White House Chief of Staff at the time, had sent an email, quote, had sent an email to an individual on the events of January 6th and said that the National Guard would be present to quote, protect pro-Trump people, and that many more would be available on standby to defend the president's interests. Because of local ability to not summon their own National Guard, 5 were killed and hundreds were injured on January 6th. Statehood gives DC the same authority as every other state to manage the National Guard, ensuring quicker response times, less federal partisanship, and more effective protection of both the city and the vital federal institutions that it houses. Moving on to contention for racial justice and representation. DC's got a majority-minority population. 45% of DC is black. The ongoing denial of statehood and voting power disproportionately disenfranchises voters of color. This isn't about democracy here. This is more racial justice. Statehood would create the first plurality black state, correcting a long history of black honors representation and affirming the nation's commitment to equal rights regardless of race. Statehood directly addresses this inequity by restoring political voice to a population historically marginalized in federal policymaking. It's a concrete civil rights action in a time that demands it, especially in the second age of Trump. Again, to run through the issues separately, DC fulfills the fundamental burdens of citizenship, right? They pay taxes, they serve on juries, yet they fundamentally are not represented in Congress. Under that right, so like they only have that one token House seat that doesn't have any voting power. They have no senators, so they have zero impact at all on ambassadors, on federal appointments, on the judiciary, especially their own judiciary. A fundamental lack of representation for people that are paying their taxes. Taxation without representation, the AF plan solves this. Again, they're denied full citizenship rights. They have no local legislative autonomy to shape the nature and course of their own government whatsoever. Right, their max number of DC legislators is capped at 13. No way to grow that number except for the feds. They're denied their full citizenship rights and are de facto second-class citizens under the status quo that the negative is going to have to come and defend. Again, the affirmative solves for this and protects rights. January 6th, enabled by national security failures, the National Guard should have been there. They weren't able to because Muriel Bowser couldn't call them. Only Trump could. Again, the AF solves for this by giving the state the ability to do that. Racial justice, or like the fourth contention, fully solved for this, making a first majority minority state to correct historical underrepresentation. Again, return to the way we value democracy. All of the affirmative contentions best solve for democracy, whereas all of the negative features of this are going to have to directly decrease access to democracy. Just concrete civil rights action, and the affirmative plan best defends that sacred, holy value of democracy. And so that's going to be a strong AF ballot. Thank you. Open for questions.
So this debate is about democracy, correct?
We argue that should be the principal weighing mechanism of the debate, yeah.
Okay, so are you aware that polling throughout multiple decades, spanning back to like the 1980s and before then, most Americans are opposed to DC citizenship. In fact, including Black Americans.
And so again, right, so the value of democracy here, we're arguing on the net benefit of that within the district. The people of DC fundamentally are in support of statehood overwhelmingly. This has been the constant for decades.
To be clear, you're saying that you're in favor of democracy, but when the voices of the American people speak for their desires, we should ignore them in favor of DC. Okay, let's move on to my next question.
That's fundamentally not true. The net opinions, I'm allowed to answer the question. The net opinions of the American people in this case,
you answered
right?
the question, I agree, and it seems like you want to ignore the majority of the opinions of Americans, including Black Americans.
The application of that of DC is fundamentally different. We'll move on.
I would like to move on, thank you. We can agree presently that DC's criminal justice system is paid for and administered by the federal government, correct?
Yes.
Are you aware that if DC were to become a state, it would lose over $750 million in funding for that criminal justice system?
Other states receive significantly more than DC does as a percentage of their overall budgets,
Can you
which is
please answer the question?
There is no budgetary harm whatsoever for DC being state
okay,
zero.
are you aware that DC itself and its agencies have calculated that the cost of becoming a state would be at minimum $750 million and at maximum $2 billion per year?
Which is an infinitesimally small fraction of their overall budget.
That's
Again, other states have bigger budgetary contributions
to be
to the feds.
clear,
There's no harm
can
there.
I ask you another question?
Yeah.
Are you aware that 25%, that's right, a quarter, 1 in 4 of DC's economy comes from federal government support?
Again, higher in in many other states. That's not a differentiating factor
Let's
for DC.
move on. It is a differentiating. Are you aware that those funds specifically come because it's a federal district? They would not receive this money if they were a state.
Other states rely on more money from the feds.
It seems like
you're
dodging the question, but I think that's apparent to
the
the
question
audience.
has zero impact at all. Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about that. This debate, you said, is also about racial justice, correct?
Yes.
Are you aware that $90 million for education is given to DC that's not given to states? DC,
Do you mean as like a percentage or like
no,
other
$90
dollars
million is given every year to DC, the schools
I
from
mean,
the federal
federal education spending is peanuts compared to what the rest of the
No,
country
I want you to
spends.
answer my questions and stop running away from them.
I mean,
Okay, my next
you're asking
question.
me, am I aware? I'm telling you yes or no.
And are you aware that that federal funding is disproportionately given to Black and Brown disadvantaged communities and schools? That's support for them.
I can't speak to the demographics of who's getting money from the DOE.
Well, I can. I'm citing statistics from the DC Fiscal Institute, which found this data after being commissioned by the Community Justice Journal.
Very nice.
Well, it's just that your testiness towards this point is concerning to me, because if this is a question of racial justice, don't you think that public educational outcomes in low-income areas and disproportionately Black areas, that things like the criminal justice system, that like these are in fact the issues of Black Americans?
Yeah, and the issues of Black Americans are better served if DC is a state. If they have full representation in the Senate to advocate for their beliefs, as it would be the first majority minority state.
Let's talk about no representation. DC votes for the president, correct?
They have 3 delegates.
Sure, they vote for the president, correct? Yes or no?
Yes, they have no senators.
Thank you. You said you called the representative delegate a non-voting delegate.
That's what it is.
But are you aware that they do vote on committees, in fact? They don't vote for bills, but in fact they vote for committees. So the idea that they have no influence is not correct.
I mean, committee votes are secondary and have no impact
Well,
on
I
actual
just
what
wish you
comes
would
to
answer
law.
my question. I want to engage honestly about the question of statehood, and it just feels like you're not engaging. Follow-up question: Why is DC not a state?
Why is DC not a state?
Yes.
I mean, decades of GOP opposition to it.
That's not true.
I mean,
DC's been a state before the GOP was even a party, in fact.
I mean, there has been staunch political opposition of the movement for DC to become a state
Do you
for
think
literally
there's any
centuries.
risk if the federal government cannot decide?
We're out of time.
Okay, thank you.
I'm ready whenever everyone else is. Are y'all good? Great. The founders created Washington as a federal city so that the operations of the government would be safe and free from domination by the states around it. James Madison wrote in Federalist 43, the indispensable necessity of complete authority at the seat of government carries its own evidence with it. Over 2 centuries later, the majority of Americans agree. Gallup found in 2021 that 2/3 of Americans oppose making DC a state. Thus, Wake is so proud to negate. DC statehood would be absolutely detrimental for 2 critical reasons. Number 1 is national security. Lawyer Zach Smith explains in the Ohio State Law Journal in 2022, history teaches us on multiple levels that state control over the seat of the federal government is net harmful. The very safety of the White House is in jeopardy with state control, even with a carve-out for federal buildings. In June 1783, a group of disgruntled Continental soldiers surrounded Congress in Philadelphia. Pennsylvania's governor refused to call out the militia to protect its members of Congress. The physical safety and security of the federal government and its members were paramount to the framers. If DC becomes a state, the federal government's ability to provide for the physical security of its officers, employees, and property is severely hampered. Portions of fencing that recently surrounded the Capitol complex and inaugural parade routes would fall within the new territory of the state. Under current statehood plans advocated for by Delegate Norton, those neighborhoods would be permanently and perhaps irrevocably cut off from the Capitol. Jeopardizing the safety of the White House is a massive national security problem. Second, when considering statehood, it is absolutely imperative to consider the costs. Statehood not only devastates our national democracy, it severely puts into jeopardy the necessary services for the people of DC. The DC Fiscal Policy Institute finds in 2021, the largest source of DC revenue is local taxes and federal funds, with the federal government accounting for over 1/4 of DC's revenue and GDP. This begs the question repeatedly posed by Representative Keller of Pennsylvania: how will DC pay for statehood? The answer, unfortunately, is through sacrificing citizen needs. The Washington Post reports in 2021, Democrats say the city is now financially self-sufficient, but the numbers don't add up. DC agencies compiled estimates that show the city would need to spend anywhere from $755 million minimum to $2 billion maximum annually on state government functions. The article goes on to say, DC could also lose more than $90 million in educational funds appropriated by Congress if it becomes a state. In fact, government officials confirmed that statehood would be financed by program cuts rather than taxes. The Washington Post finds Beverly Perry, a senior advisor to Mayor Bowser, said the district, rather than add new taxes for DC residents or commuters, should shift spending priorities and delay products to cover the cost of statehood. Even more devastatingly, the DC delegate to Congress has gone so far as to say, when discussing statehood, quote, the district does not want any special treatment and is fully prepared to lose the money. It has to pay for everything a state pays for. Housing and education funds will be first on the chopping block. When compared the likelihood of spending cuts to consumer taxes to fund statehood, the article continues, the mayor is inclined to reconfigure spending. The mayor's latest spending proposals, $400 million for affordable housing, $1.57 billion for education, are, in the mayor's exact words, sacrifices we're going to have to make to become a state. These sacrifices are damaging for the educational system. Michael Maloney of Georgetown notes in 2019 that DC school district is the highest government subsidy school district in the country. The educational inequities affect people in poor areas. So not only will DC lose $90 million in federal educational funding, but the government has stated that education and housing will be cut first in order to finance statehood. Second, not only does statehood cut critical programs for their DC residents, but abandons them in times of economic downturn. That's critical as a recession is impending in DC. The Washington Post finds this week on April 19th, economists believe that government layoffs and looming budget cuts will push Washington, D.C. into a recession. David Schleier explains that in a recession, statehood would be devastating to D.C. for 2 key reasons. Number 1, D.C.'s status as a relatively small, entirely urban area has left scholars toward whether the economic benefits outweigh the costs. Such a single city state would face drastic risk in times of economic downturn. It would be entirely one economic region, meaning almost necessarily the state would face substantial financial risk in the case of shocks. States frequently redistribute money from successful parts of the state to mitigate the unsuccessful regional downturns, but New Columbia would not have this ability. Second, in the event of fiscal catastrophe, DC would be ineligible for Chapter 9 bankruptcy as it would be a state. If the people of DC truly need voting rights and it is worth the federal sacrifice, there is a much better alternative than one that jeopardizes national security and triggers economic devastation. Dr. Keith Naughton notes in 2021, the best solution is retrocession, that is returning the vast majority of DC back to Maryland. And how do we know this will work? Because it has worked. Naughton continues, retrocession already has a precedent, as the District of Columbia originally included the cities of Arlington and Alexandria that were retroceded in Virginia in 1846. Not only does retrocession solve the representation issue, it would be in the broader interest of the people of Washington, D.C. Being part of a larger polity, Maryland reduces the risk of inherent small, narrowly focused economy and geography. D.C. residents would have a backstop for economic problems, and D.C. would have greater political control over its local needs. As part of Maryland, D.C. residents would still have federal political power disproportionate to the population. Maryland would be the 17th largest state, with 16 states in front of it representing over 230 million Americans and 70% of the population. Plus, depending on how Maryland draws its congressional map, Washington could have more than one House member. Baltimore, with over 600,000 residents, has 3. Most importantly, retrocession would give D.C. residents representation now instead of waiting and hoping for a couple of senators in the future. For Republicans, retrocession is a perfect counter to the representation argument and puts Democrats on the back foot. Outside of D.C. and the activist left, turning D.C. over to Maryland would be a sensible compromise. In the interest of preserving democracy, fostering U.S. national security, and preserving the fundamental needs of D.C. citizens, Wake is so proud to negate. Thank you. I'm good for cross whenever.
4 minutes of cross starting now, right? So as a percentage point, how much of DC's budget comes from direct federal aid from Congress?
25%.
Are other states more than that?
They don't get the same funding that DC does.
Why?
Because they're states.
So if DC was a state, would it not also be eligible for the same funding that other states get from the feds?
How much do they get?
So is it not true that Montana, Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi all get in excess of more than half of their budget from DC?
Right, they get their budget, but it's not the same budget that's given on a district basis specifically, and that's the budget that's funding specifically things like education and
yeah, right. And so if DC was to be a state, would it not be eligible for the same other grants that states themselves get if it was a state?
I mean,
correct?
You haven't specified what specific grants you're talking about.
Anything,
so.
education, food, SNAP, army bases in the jurisdiction, all kinds of federal spending. Would that also be eligible for that?
Those aren't comparable to the proportion that DC is currently getting. Other states don't have 25% of their GDP comprised of the federal government.
So when you talk about 25% GDP, you mean like spending within the district, like sales tax and stuff?
Revenue.
So how would the buildings aren't going to up and walk away? Like, is the revenue going to shrink from the feds?
What?
Is the capital going to leave DC? Like, what evidence do you have the federal spending in the district itself is going to go down?
Because the spending is on the basis of DC being a district. All of our evidence says that it would cost minimum $755 million to maximum $2 billion annually for DC to compensate.
So do you know what DC's total budget in the last year was?
I'm sure you could tell me.
Yeah, right. So significantly more than billions. I don't want to dig in the files right now.
Okay.
And so, retrocession, right? So how does retrocession affect Maryland?
It would be immensely beneficial for Maryland for DC to join.
Why?
Because they have an economic benefit. They're a very tourism-driven industry.
Can Maryland afford it?
What do you mean, can Maryland?
Can Maryland financially afford to take on the burden of providing social services to the people of DC?
I mean, we would see that DC also has its own social services. So yeah.
But if the point, if DC is going to lose all this money, then why is if DC is financially
if they synthesize their resources with Maryland's, then it would work, and they would
So you would argue right now that Maryland is in good financial condition to take on DC.
If they have the funding from DC and the funding from Maryland, then yeah, it would work.
Got it. And so how does being retrocession serve the interests of security within the district?
Can you restate the question?
So you cited security of the White House and federal buildings as a negative, as something as a disadvantage of the affirmative plan. How would going into Maryland make that better?
Wait, sorry, can you rephrase it?
How does the retrocession counter plan, or like I said, is at a disadvantage? How does retrocession solve for that harm that you're saying the affirmative creates? You're saying the affirmative makes jeopardizes federal
Maryland
buildings.
could
How does it
technically
help
deny aid, but it's far less likely to, rather than just having a very small, hyper-politicized bubble that's DC.
You think Maryland will wait? Maryland's going to deny?
Like, we think
aid.
that DC and the federal government are very hyper-politicized, and that DC is very, very left and are more likely to like cause the imbalance.
Being a district, I would agree.
Being a state, because then they'd have the capacity to.
I mean, they'd have the capacity to defend themselves by National Guard. We saw that their ability to not use their own National Guard was a major error and caused January 6th.
Right, but I think it's a great higher political tensions when you have the ability of a state to have their own national resources, and that contradicts the federal government's resources.
And so you'd still see it as a negative if that National Guard could have saved lives in January 6th if they had existed as a state?
I mean, I don't think that changes in an AF world.
Well, I mean, if it was an afro, then the National Guard would have been there earlier when Muriel Bowser wanted to be there and people wouldn't have died.
Even if DC is a state and Trump really wants to use all of his resources, he can deploy the military. I don't really think it's a unique harm, even if it is one.
Got it, okay. And then, one more question before we're done.
Yeah.
Right, so, go back, okay, the figures on American, like public opposition to statehood, could you read me that figure again?
Two-thirds of Americans oppose making DC a state.
And when was that from?
2021.
Okay, so 4 years ago.
I mean, yeah, there's no more recent poll.
I didn't think so. Okay, thank you. That's all the
Do
question.
you have one?
My opponent's ready. Is my partner ready? Alright. Let's begin. I want to talk about the resolution for this round today. The resolution being that DC should be granted statehood. Again, as my partner mentioned at the very beginning, should implies a moral obligation. We're also talking about democracy, what's right for democracy, representation, responsiveness. It's about, again, as we talked about Popple, about democracy. It's being about for the people having a right to rule, and that is what all 3 points talked about today. First off, I'm going to talk about some rebuttal regarding negative speech. So let's begin with the fact that they talk about how it's being unsafe White House security for DC to become a state. And they mentioned when we did a cross-examination, when we asked about January 6th, that didn't outweigh. However, we did talk about how over 140 policemen lost their lives that day in January 6th. 5 died, and 4 who were at the scene, they all committed suicide. That was an insurrection against our foundings as a nation. And yet, the reason why DC could not employ the National Guard is because they didn't have their own militia. Unlike Texas that has its own militia, unlike Virginia that has its own, unlike any other state, DC as a district does not have its own militia. What does that mean? It implies that whenever the mayor wants to have protection, it has to go through all these hoops and balances to get the federal guard, the National Guard, unlike Texas, who was able to, Abbott, our governor, was able to employ the National Guard regarding the immigration border. Moving on to the cost, about the jeopardy physical policy that they have, that DC becoming a state would be very would not be very cost effective, and they say that the DC uses 25% of federal funding, 25% of federal funding. But that means that there's also 75% of their own local taxes. They say that as a state, which is really confusing, because if DC becomes a state, it would also have access to other federal funding. For instance, Texas, government revenue, federal funding makes it 38% as of 2022. Not only that, but Alaska had 50.2%. Half of that. Arizona had 49.7%, and Louisiana had 50.5%. It is no new idea or nothing unique about these states becoming states or being states and then receiving high amounts of federal funding. If anything, DC only getting 25% is a good thing, because that means as a state, it'll most likely need the same amount, or at least less than. It would not be any different than Texas or Louisiana or Alaska or Arizona using a lot of money in federal. Moving on, that DC will continue to benefit federal capital activity. The buildings aren't moving around anywhere, as my opponent mentioned in cross-examination. Things like sales, consumption taxes would only grow. There was no evidence from NAG necessarily to the contrary. They don't mention any specific states because, as they mentioned earlier, Montana, Alabama, Louisiana, all these states receive over 50% of their budgets from DC. The harm there does not exist. DC is more financially dependent than many actual living states. The negative facts are therefore not applicable in this round. Moving on, about they also bring up recession, and they talk about Alexandria, how it happened in the 1780s. I'm not sure they're well about the history of Alexandria, because Alexandria has a history of slavery. That whole thing happened was because wealthy slave owners in Alexandria did not want to possibly let go of their slavery, so that's why they succeeded in forced slavery. It had drastic racial ties there. So this is why, again, moving on to the affirmative case, when we had these separate contestants that had never been rebutted yet in the negative case about taxation and representation. They do not deny the fact that citizens in DC do not have voting senators. They cannot confirm presidential appointments. They cannot confirm leadership of federal agencies. They cannot confirm U.S. ambassadors. They can't even affirm Supreme Court justices. This is true for all, even the federal courts, because they can't even choose their own judges. They will be judged maybe by the appeals, but the person who has the final say in their sentencing is not one of their own, and instead promoted by the presidential government, by the president himself. Moving on, regarding outside the taxation and representation, we also have the denial of forced citizens' rights. As I mentioned earlier, that DC, yes, they can't even have their own district judges. The Home Rule Charter 1973, the number of legislators, it's very restricted. It's only 13, despite the population growing each year. This is second-class citizenship. It's not equal. It's inherently unfair to democracy in DC because they do not have any local legislative autonomy, nor do they have full congressional representation. As regarding our third national security emergency response, we dealt with that regarding January 6th. It took more than 4 hours from the time of the Capitol Police Chief made for the call to backup for when the National Guard troop. 4 hours. 5 minutes itself is enough for a life or death situation. 4 hours. And I mentioned to you the 140 people who were injured, 4 officers who committed suicide sins, and 5 people who died. That is a direct result of the fact that DC is not its own state, does not have its own militia to protect itself, which is the exact reason why DC became separate from Pennsylvania in the first place. They became separate because they did not have their own protections, and yet with this, DC becoming the state will have its own militia. Moving on to the racial justice and representation, if anything, the Alexandria point actually falls to our side in the sense that Alexandria succeeding was an exact result of racial injustice. Here we're promoting racial justice and representation because DC is a 45% newly identifying as black. It's a majority minority population. These are about people who have been historically disenfranchised and underrepresented by others because of gerrymandering or elsewise. This is affirming the nation's commitment to equal rights. In essence, the affirmative has concrete examples that increase democracy, but side negative impacts don't functionally exist. Therefore, this round falls off to the negative side as our 4 points continue, and the negative simply provokes points that aren't actually viable or unique to the argument. Thank you.
Okay, I'm good for cross whenever you are.
I am ready.
Perfect. How much does it cost for DC to become a state?
How much does it cost for DC to become a state?
Yep.
As in, what are you asking me specifically?
I mean, there's a conversion when you receive a large portion of your funding from federal funding. Even if they eventually do get it immediately, how much does it cost?
I believe that you mentioned that earlier in your speech yourself.
Yeah, $755 million minimum to $2 billion maximum. So what specific mechanism is DC going to use to come up with that money?
You are aware they have their own money already, correct? And they can generate revenue as this process
They would
happening.
need to, in addition to that, they would need to generate a new maximum $2 billion. So through what specific mechanism would they do that?
They have their own funding, as I stated earlier.
Through what?
Through local taxes, through state taxes.
Right, so
they
I'm saying
become
when you take all of that into consideration, that's already incorporated in the 75% that doesn't come from the federal government. In addition to that, they need to raise $2 billion. So what specific mechanism are they going to do that through?
DC currently does not have a state income tax, as other states do. However, when they become a state, they were going to get money from that. And as we know,
Okay, so it's just
a lot of
local
I'm
taxes.
answering your question.
Yeah, for sure,
A
but
lot
I
of
think you answered
Congressional leaders make a
it.
lot of money there, so they have high tax rates.
Okay, perfect.
Mhm.
We can agree that Trump's a Republican, obviously. Red
Yes.
Senate, Red House. Are they going to be happy about DC statehood?
I'm not sure what your question is asking me of.
I mean, would you assume that the majority of Republicans right now in the House, Senate, and presidency are in favor of DC statehood?
I cannot assume that. I cannot assume that they need to approve or disapprove of this.
Well, I'm just asking about if they'd be like happy or not if they pass it.
I genuinely can't answer that because I am not a Republican House representative or House senator.
Okay, so I think based off of like the various quotes from Republican representatives, they're pretty against DC statehood. So insofar as they control all 3 branches of the government right now, would they want to fund DC given that we basically just spit in their face that becoming a state?
I do not see any actual quotes that you've given to me so far in this debate. However, just because a set of Republicans don't appreciate DC becoming a state doesn't mean that it can't. Again, we're talking about
Wait,
we're
that's not
talking
really
about
my question, but you said that they'd still give a ton of federal funding to DC even after it becomes a state. So if all Republicans are opposing DC statehood, what's the incentive for them to continue that federal funding?
Republicans were also against giving money to Ukraine, and yet that still passed.
I think that everyone was in favor of giving money to Ukraine for a second there. Do you think that the National Guard should be able to challenge federal authority?
The National Guard challenging federal authority?
That's the question. Yeah.
I'm not sure of an instance where the National Guard would be fighting against
Or-
federal authority here.
Well, you're giving me the example of January 6th. You would have wanted the state government to call in the National Guard, right?
The District of Columbia needed the National Guard to protect itself against the insurrectionists.
Right. So imagine a different situation where you have a state government. Now they can use their militia to fight with the federal government. Do you think that would be appropriate?
I don't see that occurring in DC and how it's applicable to this situation.
Well, it's a hypothetical. I mean, we can't really foresee national security threats before they manifest.
Okay, this is not a hypothetical we're dealing with. We're dealing with DC becoming a
The
state.
debate is a hypothetical, but all right. We understand wishes to become the fact that DC wishes to become a state is your claim. Does that mean that any other country or part of a country that wants to become a state should be able to do it?
Regarding the United States?
Sure.
Not exactly.
Why not? Did their democracy matter less than people in DC?
Because every other state in the U.S. colony has full voting representation rights. They all have House senators, they all have House representatives, they have different issues than the DC has. DC is currently facing a crisis in democracy.
Okay, but you could say that there are citizens in cities like Detroit, Atlanta, that feel like they're misrepresented. Would you feel that it would be appropriate for them to become states?
Do they not have House representatives?
You could say your basis on argumentation is that they feel misrepresented. Right now, DC has a voting in committee House of Representative member. They have 3 electoral votes. They, based on what was given to them, feel misrepresented. So does that mean that the feeling of misrepresentation is enough to warrant statehood?
This is not a feeling of representation. This is an exact definition of, because they have no actual voting member in the House of
If
Representatives
this
and they
was
have no
really a
senators.
deciding factor for DC residents, why can't they move?
Is everyone ready?
Yep.
Judge, are you ready? All right. Representation means nothing if your city can't afford to keep the lights on and your federal government cannot function. We've advanced 2 major disadvantages to DC statehood and a more productive alternative that solves the main offense of the act without destroying our nation. First off, let's talk national security. Let's revisit the Pennsylvania Mutiny of 1783, which the affirmative has said 0 words about. When Congress had to flee the Independence Hall because Pennsylvania refused to send its militia. That crisis taught us why the federal government needs autonomy. If DC became a state, its governor would control the National Guard with the power to delay or deny deployment in a crisis, a risk no other state poses at the seat of federal power. The founders carved out DC as a neutral district on purpose. In fact, it had nothing to do with racial animosity. James Madison in Federalist 43 emphasized the capital must be independent so that no state could exert undue influence over the Union. Roger Pyler reminds us, a constitutional scholar, that statehood would mean the federal government is suddenly reliant on DC for, quote, all manner of services. Everything from electrical power, water, sewer, snow relief, police, and fire protection, end quote. It's reckless to give one city that kind of leverage. Imagine a DC governor cutting power to the capital or withholding emergency services. Statehood would give a city of less than a million veto power over the federal government. This is what you should be comparing directly to their example of January 6th. The answer to the January 6th is that we should have voted in a different president. It is not acceptable to allow a state affairs where when DC and the federal government have a disagreement on how the National Guard, on how protecting our capital should work, we should defer to a city of less than a million. That's completely undemocratic, and it goes against the principles that you claim as the affirmative that you are trying to protect. It's dangerous and it's reckless. In this debate, we cannot just be concerned with the question of Trump, because this nation existed before Trump and it's going to exist after. When it comes to the practical logistics of what it would mean to encourage an environment where we have constant conflict between the mayor of the governor and federal national government, that is a far more dangerous state of affairs than what they have created out. Do not buy their rhetoric, do not buy the fairy tales, do not buy the emotional appeals. What happened in January 6th was unfortunate. It is not solved by allowing DC to act as a veto for federal government. Now, next let's talk about the economy. Let's talk dollars and cents. DC statehood would trigger massive funding losses. Reports estimate the cost to be $755 million and $2 billion. And to be clear, this is coming from DC's own leaders and agencies, which are admitting that the gap would be covered by cuts to core services. When we asked this around, where's the extra money coming from? They have no answer because they know the answer is cuts. And this is how you should frame their entire articulations about racial advantages. Because these issues of $90 million in educational funding that goes disproportionately to black and brown schools, these issues of criminal justice systems, these issues are racial equality issues. These are the issues of the black constituents of DC. And to cut that federal funding means that they're left out to dry. It does not matter if my opponents say what happened through taxes if DC's own mayor and delegates has stated that statehood is funded through program cuts. I want to be clear, the DC Policy Center makes clear what's at stake. That $90 million, that, to be clear, only comes because DC is a district. That's teacher pay, that's low-income student programs, that's school materials, that's COVID recovery funds. Now, their main refrain to this is two things. First, DC will raise taxes. Well, you've already said in your first seat that DC already pays the highest amount in federal income tax. So what will more regressive tax? Who's that going to hurt? The black and brown populations of DC. And second, they say that they're going to get federal state grants. They've not named a singular grant. And I ask you, in a world where DC specifically has statehood so it can contest the federal government and is in constant conflict, what incentive does the federal government have to give them grants? You're putting DC in a dangerous situation where the people there will suffer. As a final aside, I would like to point out we saw what happened when DC tried to go it out on their own. In 2018, a modest cut in budgets forced 100% layoffs, nearly 10% of the workforce. That was just from a budget trend to the criminal justice system. Imagine what happens with a full federal withdrawal, and that's just the criminal justice system. Healthcare, infrastructure, all the things that people need to live their lives, that goes under threat in the world of the affirmative. Second, they completely dropped this argument. It's not just about federal fundings, it's about economic fragility, shocks, and recession. Law professor David Schleicher, as we cited in the first speech, explains why DC's economy is uniquely fragile, because it's small, dense, and undiversified. Other states can cushion recessions by shifting resources. DC can't. It's one city, one industry. The risk is not hypothetical. We have a recession coming now. DC would be put in a scenario where they'd be at odds with the federal government. They would not have the industry nor the funds to cover for basic resources, and they would lack the other mobility that other states have because they would now be a small, fragile, one-dimensional economy. It's also worth noting that DC would lose the ability to declare Chapter 9 bankruptcy because they'd be a state. On retrocession, this does not get answered in the affirmative. It answers all their questions. Their main refrain is they need a senator, they need a senator, they need a senator. If you want a senator, go back to Maryland, the territory from which you came from. DC statehood is a dangerous gamble, but there's a better option, retrocession. Retrocession gives residents representation while creating a fragile microstate. Maryland already serves over 6 million people. It's bigger, more stable, and far less volatile than a single state. They say national security, but what they miss is that DC is Maryland is far less likely to have the dangerous standoff that DC would. DC is a small, hyper-excited bubble full of the most opinionated people in the government. Its leaders routinely posture as the federal authority. Maryland has broader responsibilities and more to lose from a standoff. DC is a pressure cooker, Maryland is a buffer. If this is really about representation, retrocession solves it. If it's about power, the act must explain why we should hand over veto power and federal operations to the most politically charged city in America. Thank you. I stand ready for calls.
Is my judge ready? Is my opponent ready?
Yep.
Okay. You mentioned that DC is going to have control of the capital. Did we ever say that the state of DC would have the capital under its bounds?
Yes, your first contention is specifically about how you want National Guard to be controlled by DC, and in fact you want it to be able to contradict the federal government's authority about how troops should be deployed. It seems to be like the crux of your argument, in fact, that type of overreach is part and parcel with the AF's benefits.
Okay. So the capital, we never stated the capital was under DC future state control.
This is just a natural consequence of getting rid of DC,
Gotcha.
And we cited a constitutional scholar.
Moving on to my next question about the question of Trump. How is Trump at all related to this?
So there's two parts. First, you've explicitly made Trump a part of this. Remember, we had a whole conversation about January 6th and how DC should have intervened in it. Second, you contend that DC is going to make up the funding through grants. And we state, if the way DC becomes a state is particularly to contest the federal government and they're in constant standoffs with them, that means DC is not going to get
Okay.
those types of grants and funding and
Moving on to our
incentivizing.
next question.
Okay.
Once states become states, they can have their own state tax, correct?
Yes, we discussed this. We
Okay.
said
so they can
that.
have a state tax, and they can also have like an income tax.
Well, who do you think that will hurt? DC, as you already said, has the highest federal income tax of any city in the world. Who do you think will be hurt by more taxes?
Moving on about, I don't believe we ever mentioned about them having the highest rate of taxation.
Well, it's true. I'm pretty sure it was in your first speech, but it's objectively true. They do.
You
And that's a
mentioned-
regressive tax that will hurt the black and brown people that you claim to represent in this round.
Okay, you mentioned about that they should go back to Maryland, but you are aware of Alexandria's history.
I
Of
don't
racism,
know
correct?
the relevance. Alexandria was given back after slavery ended. It seems like the people of Alexandria have mostly benefited. You've cited like no evidence that there's malice, and the fact of all of America is built on a history of racism. But that doesn't change the fact that your proposal will hurt black and brown Americans. And in fact, it's worse for racial equality.
Okay, moving on. You talk about how that there was a DC, there was a budget cut in 2018 that led to layoffs. Do you necessarily believe that there has to be a cut in budget for DC?
I don't believe this. DC delegates and agencies believe this.
Okay.
We've quoted them directly.
Okay. Moving on to the fact about our own contentants
Sure.
regarding the representation. How is DC supposed to be moving to Maryland going to solve the fact that they have no House of Representatives?
They
no
would have
voting members of House of
If
Representatives.
you're a part of Maryland, you now have access to Maryland's House of Representatives and Senators. It solves all the arguments. So if this is about DC having a disproportionate ability to influence the country, which it seems like the act actually wants, no, it does not about that. This is about representation, as you so claim. Retrocession is clearly the better option.
Okay. Are you aware of how many electoral votes that Maryland has?
I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay. Interesting. Moving on to regarding the other points that we have about the Supreme Court justices. Do you believe that people should be tried by judges who don't know them at all, who aren't a part of that community?
So the reason this occurs is because DC does not have the money to fund its own criminal justice system. That's the statistics we give them below. Maryland solves this. Then you'll have extra funding from Maryland, and you'll be able to also engage in Maryland systems and engage in criminal justice reforms.
Okay, but that does not necessitate that those justices will be from DC.
Well, yes, DC will vote for them. They'll have their own district when they're enfolded into Maryland.
Okay. I believe that is about time. Thank you.
You have 10 seconds if you have one more question.
You're alright. You're fine.
You need to win the
my judge ready?
Mhm.
Are my opponents ready?
Okay.
Is my partner ready? Alright, so, thank you, Judge, for being here today, because this is our 4th round, so let's see how it goes. I'm going to go down the ballot, just no arguments, and then extending our own advantages. One of the number one contenders here is that national security, its federal control of DC's National Guard, was put on national spectacle when it failed to work. Negative supports this when it was literally put to same on January 6th. Federal control of DC's National Guard widely failed to safeguard human life and is not a working option. Affirmative solves this by making DC a state and providing its own militia. They talk about how they mentioned that DC is going to promote a governor who's going to then prevent their own militia from protecting itself. DC has 92% Democratic and only 6% Republican. The idea that a Republican governor, possibly Republican governor because most of them are Democratic, are going to take over and prevent the militia from protecting the citizens is not at all viable in the situation. So therefore, the argument of national security is not viable in this argument. They also talk about cost. The fact is about massive $2 billion that DC owns leaders and agencies, that's cut core agencies. DC is very well off. Other states are significantly more reliant on concerns towards the feds, as I mentioned in my previous argument about Texas receiving over 38% of its overall government revenue. I talked about Louisiana, 55.5%. I talked about Alaska, 50.2%. I talked about Arizona, 49.7%. These other states receive a lot more of the total budget from federal funding, and yet DC only has requiring 25% at the moment. Even if it went up to 50%, it would still not be the number one state with the highest weight of money given to it by the federal government. And also, to put an example, when they talk about $2 billion, Vermont, which is a state with very similar population amount, about the same amount of 700,000, combined state and local general revenues, states, because DC became a state, was $9 billion alone in the fiscal year of 2021. $9 billion. I see no actual viable reason from that why DC's new creation of state taxes would not at least be as equal to $9 billion, or at least be able to overcome these costs. They simply say the statistic that this is the war that they're going to have. But even the DC mayor said herself, I believe I was the mayor, that these are sacrifices we are willing to make. Those sacrifices for a reason. When you say sacrifice, that implies that you're willing to do so. Moving on about this is going to hurt black and brown. The federal government awards hundreds of billions of dollars in grants and local governments all the time. They always give money, whether it's in installments, whether it's in just about everything else. DC would receive significant federal assistance, just like every other state in the union. The feds have the same incentive to fund DC as they fund every other state in the same position. We assume it will, as a state, be treated as a state because it is a state in the first place. Negative offers no actual evidence to disapprove this. DC can receive as a state Medicaid, infrastructure projects, disaster relief, education, just like every other state. Again, negative never actually gives us evidence to believe this should be any different. Talking about how negative assumes all federal operations in DC would end. That is not the case. Affirmative only opposes a jurisdictional change, not a termination of any federal programs. Not only that, but I don't know if you're all aware as of the House Bill 51, which 2023 to 2024, which specifically states that DC would become a state. However, the Capitol building, just the White House, would be its own separate district still. So therefore, it prevents the fact that DC would have control over the Capitol itself. No, it would become a state. It would have separate, those decent, like, federal buildings would still remain under federal jurisdiction. Moving on about how they claim that, and one of the points about the fragile economy, that they can't claim bankruptcy because DC will no longer be a state. States can fully declare bankruptcy. When the 13 colonies first joined the Union, they declared bankruptcy themselves, so there's no difference here regarding DC declaring bankruptcy. DC itself dissolves sovereignty. This is where Maryland has broader democracies. Negative saying that, like, congressmen, like DC having the 2 senators and 1 actual voting House of Representatives from a majority black city would be bad for civil rights because it's not like, this is not like a good thing and never negate all in point. Negative only opposes a highly belligerent tone and a substance about what's bad for civil rights, but the affirmative has positive and concrete examples and impacts. The status quo defended by negative sees that 700,000 people with no senators. Roger Session only dilutes senatorial representation instead of giving a massive majority black city the representation they're entitled to. And they dissolve following centuries of racist oppression. We both agree that black people have been disenfranchised this entire time. And by making DC a majority minority state, you are promoting goodness for once. Not only that, Roger Session is also opposed by people of DC, and 57% up Maryland for Axios and the 2 AC. Moving on, AF increases representation by giving DC senators. AF increases responsiveness by making the National Guard responsive to DC itself. It only has its own militia. Affirmative increases protections of rights by giving them local legislative autonomy. They can actually control the people who are actually judging them, so therefore they won't have any racial or discriminatory practices when they're being sentenced to life or imprisonment. DC population, according to Popper's definition of democracy, solves according to the weighing of today's round. So what did I tell you today? is the fact that Negative's points aren't viable. Because not only did I talk about national security, which we talked about because they're going to have their own protection, they can protect themselves. We talked about the immunity. They didn't have protection because they didn't want to get any protection from other states. The Capitol building will still have its own militia because of the national guard. It's still going to be under federal jurisdiction. But DC can finally protect itself and have its own military when, protesters or insurrectionists come in and attack themselves. Not only that, but the points about cost, massive billions of dollars, it can be removed because of state tax. That's just fact. That's how states make money, and even so, they can get bailouts from the government whenever it wants. To the point because again, we know that plenty of states have already gotten money in federal funding, whether it's education or infrastructure, as I watched you the different mentions. Not only that, but the jobs economy that is not viable today, and therefore the affirmative wins this round because we provided you 4 different points of how DC becoming a state is good for us. Because not only does it install taxation representation, because now they finally have senators who can vote on legislation and actually have a say. Not only do they have actually full citizen rights, because now they can actually control the people who are sentencing them to imprisonment, but they also have national security and emergency response, and it's promoting racial justice for once in United States history. Thank you.
Let me know when everyone's ready. The single most important question in this debate is what happens to the people of DC post-retrocession. The affirmative has theory, the negative has facts. At the end of the day, this is a question of what happens to the citizens of DC. There are 3 key reasons you are voting for the affirmative team today, or the negative team today. The first is on spending cuts. It's impossible to discuss DC statehood without asking 2 critical questions. Number 1, what's the price? And number 2, who is paying? The facts are simple. If DC became a state, they would need to spend at minimum $755 million to maximum $2 billion annually. Even if they get federal government funding, these are the calculations that the DC government has come up with that they know they'll have to pay if they become a state. The affirmative cannot tell you who is footing the bill absent federal government involvement, but the answer is simple and it comes from current DC officials. They have repeatedly stated that in order to pay for statehood, DC will delay and cut from social welfare programs like healthcare, housing, education. The delegate to Congress has said that DC is prepared to lose the money, and the mayor has said that the $400 million for affordable housing and $1.7 billion for education are sacrifices that they are going to have to make. Now, the affirmative says a couple of things. Number 1, the affirmative says that they are going to proceed to receive federal funding, but realize that passing statehood in a world that is entirely controlled by Republicans in the Senate, the House, the presidency, they are not going to be happy about statehood. They are not going to want this newfound state that opposes everything they stand for, millions of dollars in federal funding. Second, the affirmative says that DC is going to implement taxes. There is no evidence read by the affirmative that says this, whereas we read evidence from DC politicians, mayors, officials that say that it's not going to be taxes, they're going to be program cuts. The affirmative is advocating for a policy that is not only opposed by 2/3 of Americans, but that is subsidized by DC's poorest and most vulnerable residents. The second place to vote negative is our argument about economic distress. This argument is not responded to. Evidence from this week proves that DC is about to enter a recession. First, DC will not be able to apply for bankruptcy, which means they will not receive federal assistance. The affirmative says that this is not true, but the law is very clear. Under current U.S. bankruptcy law, an area governed by federal law does not allow a state to file for bankruptcy under the bankruptcy code. Second, DC is not economically diverse. When a state goes into a recession, they can use funding from the affluent parts of the state and reallocate that funding to the struggling parts of the state. DC is very small. It's not economically diverse. That means when this recession inevitably hits, if they lose federal funding and all their social welfare programs are cut, they are not going to be able to recover.
affirmative not only destroys the welfare programs for DC's poorest and weakest, but simultaneously abandons citizens on times of downturn. On other states, the affirmative isn't engaging with reality of what statehood looks like for DC. Take a moment to consider states like Louisiana, Missouri are stricken by poverty. The AF is arguing to voluntarily put DC in that situation. The clearest solution is retrocession. Retrocession solves for every single harm outlined by the affirmative team. Do you want increased representation? You will get it through Maryland, and it will be more legitimate than creating the smallest and most fragile state in the United States. Let's give Maryland back to Maryland. Now, how do we know this will work? The proof is in the president. It has worked before. Look to Arlington, look to Alexandria. We gave Virginia back to Virginia, and now they're thriving. There's no reason outlined by the affirmative that this would be different. Now let's look at their best arguments on democracy. They make this a question of what do U.S. citizens want? 66% of U.S. citizens oppose DC statehood. I would argue it's extremely and fundamentally undemocratic to create a constitutional amendment that legitimizes a state opposed by 66% of American citizens. Taxation over representation is a punchy catchphrase, but it's not accurate and it's not a reason to affirm. Representation means nothing if your city can't afford to keep the lights on and your federal government cannot function. What is the point of a senator if children can't read, if education is slashed, if you don't have health care or a place to live, if we can't pay for judges or courts? But then realize that DC citizens do have representation even if without Maryland retrocession. First, DC citizens vote for the president. They have a delegate in the House that can vote on committee and influence major decisions. If they would like a senator, then they should join Maryland. Anything sacrifices the black and brown people of DC for affirmative political ambitions. If you value racial equality, then you vote negative to prioritize questions of criminal justice, education, and the welfare of black DC residents. Now let's go on to the last major point outlined by the affirmative in today's debate, national security. They have stated there is a carve-out for federal buildings, which was, by the way, not mentioned before in this debate. But even if that's true, that means there is a carve-out for the Capitol building, which means even if their advocacy is 100% true, they cannot solve for the events of January 6th. Then, affirming is a major national security issue because it will allow the state to come into direct clash with the federal government. We know that January 6th was a Trump problem, but just imagine now that the roles were reversed. If we allow state governments to call in the National Guard, to activate militias that put in jeopardy not just the region, but the entire national security of the United States, the White House, the Capitol building, that puts us in jeopardy and makes us look embarrassing to the rest of the world if small parts of our nation are attacking its capital. Then, retrocession solves because Maryland is far less likely than DC to engage in standoffs and aggressives. DC is not just any city, it's small, it's hyper-politicized bubble full of the most opinionated people in the country, many of whose careers are vested in pushing back against the federal government. Its leaders routinely postured against federal authority. Maryland has broader responsibilities and more to lose from a standoff. DC is a pressure cooker, but Maryland is a buffer. The AF has rhetoric, the negative has evidence. Take into consideration, is it worth slashing welfare programs? Is it worth sentencing DC to an economic recession? If any of this is worth it, you are clearly voting neg. Thank you.
Thank you. Good debate.
Great debate. Thank you for judging.
All right, thank you all for your comments. I encourage you to shake hands, get to know each other. It's supposed to be civic type debate.